She returned to Seoul after 5 years of silence. The first snowfall brought memories of love, loss, and healing. A heartfelt story of grief, rediscovery, and quiet resilience in a city that never forgot her. A journey through winter toward the promise of spring. The first snowfall of the year always brought back memories. As the flakes drifted down, coating the city in white, Yoon Ha-eun stood by the cafe window, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long since cooled. The city outside moved in shades of gray and pale light. People trudging through slush-stained sidewalks, scarves wrapped tightly around necks, shoulders hunched against the wind. The dim hum of life pulsed around her, muffled by the snow, softened by the moment. Inside, the cafe was a world apart. It breathed in low murmurs, the heater humming steadily, the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain blending with the rustle of pages being turned. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. Her seat by the window framed the world like a moving painting, one in which she no longer felt like a part of the landscape. She watched the falling snow with the gaze of someone who had returned to a place once familiar, now foreign. It had been 5 years since she last set foot in Seoul. 5 winters had passed in another land, under different skies, in the anonymity of foreign streets and crowded subways. The city before her hadn't changed much, but the person who once called it home had. Familiarity clashed with distance in every step she took on the pavement, in every face that almost looked like someone she used to know. Her reflection in the window looked older, not just from time, but from absence, from having lived a life away from everything she had once known. Seoul still smelled the same, of roasting chestnuts on street corners, of sweet hotdogs steaming in paper sleeves, of gasoline and cold metal, and of too many memories. The Han River still shimmered like a mirror broken by winter winds. The neon signs blinked and buzzed in the same restless rhythm. But the weight of those sights pressed against her differently now. The city was unchanged. Yet for her, every building, every alley, every season bore a fracture that wasn't visible to others. Her past lingered in those cracks. There was a time when she had believed in permanence, in the strength of foundations built carefully over time. Love, dreams, and ambition had once seemed like unshakable pillars in her life. Her path had been drawn in ink, not pencil, meant to be lasting. But ink smudges too easily under grief. Certainty, she learned, was the most fragile illusion of all. In the years that followed, she had busied herself with building a new version of life. It had been easier to move forward when the past was a continent away. She built routines, filled calendars, and made friends who knew nothing of what had come before. She smiled in photographs, attended meetings, signed leases, and tried new foods. To the world, she was functional. But beneath all that, there had always been a pull, soft, persistent, inevitable. Her return to Seoul had not been of her choosing. A work obligation, a necessary presentation, an unavoidable deadline. That was how she had justified it. But the truth was more layered. There was a quiet part of her that had always known this day would come, the day she would return, not as who she had been, but as the one shaped by all the years that had passed since. Landing at Incheon Airport had unraveled her carefully constructed distance. The first breath of winter air outside the terminal had filled her lungs with the past. Her taxi ride through the city had felt like falling through time, each landmark a page from a closed chapter she thought she had sealed. The memories had begun with spring, a warm day, the scent of early blossoms in the air, and the promise of something new. That was when she met Ji-hwan. The memory played not as a moment but as a feeling. Sunlight against her skin, laughter echoing in open spaces, a sense of becoming. He had appeared in her life not with grand gestures, but with a quiet confidence that disarmed her caution. She, who had always moved carefully, calculating steps, measuring outcomes, had found herself stepping into spontaneity beside him. He had carried with him an ease she hadn't known she needed. The way he greeted strangers, found beauty in the mundane, and seemed always at home in the moment. Together, they had filled days with long walks through half-lit alleys and rooftop conversations as the sun dipped below the skyline. They chased fireflies in the mountains, shared meals from convenience stores under bridges, and watched movies on old projectors in empty basements. Time passed unmeasured because with him it didn't need to be counted. They had once written dreams together on slips of paper and burned them in a lantern, watching it rise over the river. They had believed in someday. Someday meant travel, shared apartments, careers slowly climbing upward, lazy Sunday mornings wrapped in warmth and sunlight. It meant weddings attended hand in hand, the occasional argument over silly things, and the promise of growing old. But someday never accounted for sickness. Ji-hwan's illness came quietly, like a wrong note in a familiar song barely noticed at first, then impossible to ignore. He began missing outings. Fatigue painted itself under his eyes. She remembered the hospital corridors most vividly, the pale green of the walls, the scent of antiseptic, and the hollow sound of footsteps in quiet halls. Those places were now etched in her mind like scars. The early days were filled with hope. Doctors spoke of chances, of plans, of trials. They clung to optimism like a raft. She memorized medication schedules, adjusted meals, and measured temperatures. She became fluent in medical terms no one should ever have to learn. But hope, too, was fragile. It frayed under waiting, under watching someone she loved diminish in strength. Time blurred. Seasons passed, but she measured them by appointments and treatments, by the length of hospital stays, by the sound of machines in the dark. There were moments when he smiled still, when they laughed despite it all, and those moments became precious, like rare gems found in ash. But even laughter began to feel like defiance. The end came on a winter morning. The sky had been heavy with snow, the kind that silences the world. She remembered standing outside the hospital for hours after, unable to go home. The city moved around her, unknowing. Somewhere, children were building snowmen. Somewhere, lights were being strung across storefronts. Somewhere, life continued. In the days that followed, she packed what little she could and left. She didn't tell many people. She didn't say goodbye. She boarded a plane and carried with her only what could fit in 2 suitcases and the silent company of grief. She told herself it was for a fresh start, but what she sought was escape. She landed in a place where the language was unfamiliar, where no one knew her name, where memories didn't hang from every tree, every window, every bench by the river. But grief is not a thing left behind. It traveled with her, nestled quietly in the spaces between waking and sleep. It appeared in the scent of certain flowers, in songs that played on supermarket speakers, and in faces that almost resembled his. She built her life around its presence, not in denial, but in accommodation. For 5 years, she survived. Some days she even lived. She achieved what she thought she wanted: work success, stability, a version of normal. Yet through it all, there was the echo of a life left unfinished. And now she was here again, back in the place where it had all begun and ended. She had walked past the old bookstore they once frequented, past the bench where he had first held her hand. The bakery on the corner had closed down, but the smell of bread still lingered from somewhere nearby. These were not just places. They were fragments of another life. Snow continued to fall outside the cafe. She stepped outside, letting the cold air fill her lungs. It stung, sharp and real. She pulled her coat tighter, not to shield herself, but to feel the weight of now. The streets were quieter than usual, blanketed in white, footsteps disappearing as quickly as they were made. The sky hung low and gray, as if pressing gently on the world. She walked without aim, not because she was lost, but because the city itself was a map of memory. Each street turned into a recollection. The lantern festival where they made wishes, the park where he had once drawn her portrait with clumsy strokes, the old theater where they had watched a movie neither of them liked, but couldn't stop quoting for weeks. Every corner held him, not in the haunting way it had before, but in something gentler, softer. Time had reshaped the sharpness of pain into something else, something like longing, something like quiet acceptance. It didn't erase the ache, but it no longer overwhelmed her. The Han River shimmered in the distance, partially frozen. She followed the path along its edge, the trees bare and skeletal, the benches dusted with snow. There had been a time when she avoided this place, when even the thought of standing here alone had been too much. But now she simply watched the water move beneath thin sheets of ice, its current steady, patient. Winter always felt like an end, but he had once told her it was only a pause. That buried beneath the snow, life waited. Those buds formed even when no one could see them. That spring came not because one wished for it, but because it always did. And as she stood there, the city quiet around her, the sky low, the snow relentless but soft, she began to understand. Grief did not end. It changed shape, and love, the kind that once rooted her to a place and to a person, remained not as a weight but as a thread that connected her past to her present. She turned from the river and continued walking, not away but forward. Snow continued to fall through the city like time itself, quiet, persistent, indifferent. Yoon-hun moved through its stillness as if retracing her own shadow. The rhythm of her footsteps aligned with the hush of the world, and the cold became something she carried rather than resisted. She walked past shuttered storefronts and old buildings wrapped in winter's silence. Each step felt like reopening a letter she had sealed years ago. Each corner turned like unfolding a photograph she had tried not to look at. The city no longer stung the way it once had. There was grief still, but now it whispered instead of howling. The memories stirred gently as she passed places once steeped in joy and sorrow. The noodle shop they had visited on rainy days had been replaced by a modern cafe. A mural on a brick wall had faded, the colors muted by seasons of weather and time. The tree near the university entrance where he once carved their initials into the bark had been trimmed, its branches shorter, its scars no longer visible. She paused by the steps of the art museum, its columns dusted with snow, the banners changed to new exhibits. The air carried the weight of stillness, as though the world held its breath, waiting for her to reclaim something she had long buried. She remembered the day they visited that museum together, years ago, wandering among paintings and sculptures, holding hands in the quiet. She had studied each piece with the curiosity of someone who wanted to understand the artist's soul. He had wandered beside her, content not to understand, but to feel. Her feet led her to familiar neighborhoods, quiet now beneath the weight of snow, but once vibrant with color and laughter. She passed a street market, its stalls closed for the evening. The remnants of the day lingered, faint footprints, a forgotten box of produce, the fading scent of spices. These were the bones of the city she had loved, the traces of ordinary life still unfolding without her. But now, she didn't feel like a stranger. She felt like a returning ghost who had found peace with her own haunting. Back in her temporary apartment, the radiator clanked rhythmically, like a tired metronome counting the seconds too slowly. The place was clean and efficient, a short-term rental devoid of any personal touch. A suitcase sat in the corner, half open, its contents carefully folded but untouched. She hadn't unpacked fully, as if hesitant to settle in, unsure whether this return was a visit or something more. The windows offered a view of rooftops turned pale under snow, their edges softened, their lines erased. She stood by the glass, tracing the skyline with her eyes, remembering a night years ago when she had watched stars from a rooftop nearby, beside the boy who had once made her laugh until she cried. He had believed in constellations and stories, in wishes whispered to the night sky. She had believed in him. Her phone buzzed on the table with an email from work, a reminder of the presentation scheduled for next week. Deadlines, statistics, timelines, the language of efficiency. It felt distant, like a foreign tongue spoken in the echo of a cathedral. She closed the email untouched. The city outside called to her in a different voice. The next day, she took the subway to the northern part of the city, to the quiet hills where old neighborhoods remained unchanged by time. She walked through winding lanes lined with stone walls, past Hanukkah houses with snow-laden roofs. It was here, on one of these narrow streets, that they had once found a tiny art shop tucked between two larger buildings. The shop was gone now, replaced by a boutique clothing store. The sign above the door was sleek and new, and the window displayed mannequins dressed in winter coats and curated minimalism. But she remembered the way it used to be, how the windows once showcased handmade pottery, each piece flawed and beautiful. How they had spent hours inside, touching the rough edges of cups and plates, running fingers along the uneven curves of bowls shaped by uncertain hands. Juwan had once bought a chipped mug from that shop, saying it reminded him of her not because it was broken, but because it was honest. She had rolled her eyes then, but she had used that mug for years, long after it had cracked further and finally shattered. She continued walking. The hills rose gently beneath her feet and the view widened. The city stretched below like a map of memories layered, chaotic, precious. Her path led her to the cemetery near the base of the mountain. She had avoided this place for so long, not out of fear, but because she hadn't known what she would say if she stood there again. But now she came not to speak, but to be. The snow blanketed everything in a quiet reverence. The gravestones stood in orderly rows, names and dates softened by frost and time. She found his name among them. The stone was simple, no ornamentation, just the clean etching of a life that had burned brightly and ended too soon. She brushed the snow from the base, her gloved hand trembling slightly. She sat beside the grave, cross-legged in the snow, letting the cold seep through the layers of her coat. She didn't need to speak to fill the silence. Her presence was enough. In that quiet, she felt everything that words could never hold. She stayed there for a long time, watching the snow fall, watching time fold in on itself. When she rose to leave, she placed a single white camellia on the stone. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a whisper of remembrance, a promise that she hadn't forgotten, that she had carried him with her through every street, every season, every breath. Days passed. The city began to thaw, if only slightly. The snow turned to slush in the gutters. Lights blinked to life in windows earlier each evening. Children built snowmen in neighborhood parks. The city was beginning to shift, as it always did, one subtle change at a time. She returned to the cafe where she had first stood upon arriving. This time she ordered a warm drink and drank it before it cooled. She didn't sit by the window, but near the back, where the world outside felt less demanding. She wrote in a notebook she had brought with her, something she hadn't done in years. Not for work, not for obligation, but for herself. Lines spilled onto the pages, thoughts, reflections, pieces of the past she had finally made peace with. She visited old places deliberately now. The library where she once spent late nights cramming for exams. The bridge where they had once watched fireworks on New Year's Eve. The apartment building where he had lived had different tenants now, a different paint color on the door, but the memories remained. She didn't flinch when she saw these places. She welcomed them like chapters in a book she was finally ready to reread. She wandered through the university campus on a Sunday morning. The lecture halls were closed, the grounds quiet. The ginkgo trees were bare, their golden leaves long swept away. But she could still see herself here, younger, laughing, running late to class, her hand entwined with his as they skipped lunch to watch the clouds. These memories no longer hurt. They glowed with the light of something sacred, something complete. Her presentation approached. She attended meetings, reviewed materials, and spoke with colleagues. Her voice was calm, her presence assured. She delivered the presentation flawlessly, her gestures confident, her answers precise. But even as she stood in the spotlight, she understood now that this was only one part of her. The person she had become was not defined solely by accomplishment, but by resilience, by love, by the quiet strength that came from learning how to live with loss. She extended her stay, not indefinitely, but long enough to walk the city without agenda. She began noticing new details: art painted on alley walls, unfamiliar cafes nestled between old structures, and the smell of tangerines in winter markets. The city had grown while she was gone. So had she. One afternoon, she returned to the park by the river. The ice had begun to melt along the edges, the current visible beneath. Birds called to one another from bare branches, and people jogged slowly along the winding paths. She sat on a bench, gloves in her lap, the cold biting at her fingertips. She watched the river move, steady and certain. There was no great epiphany, no sudden moment where everything made sense. But there was peace, a quiet understanding that some stories end not with closure, but with continuation. That grief would ebb and flow, sometimes rising like tidewater, other times receding into stillness. That the love she had known would never vanish, but would instead become part of the fabric of her being, woven into the way she observed the world, into the gentleness she offered others, into the depth of her silence. Spring would come, it always did, and with it, life would begin again in ways she could not yet predict. As the sun began to set behind the city's jagged skyline, casting gold across the snow-speckled rooftops, Yoon Ha-eun stood once more. The wind tugged gently at her coat as she turned from the river, her footsteps marking a new path through the soft, uneven snow. She did not look back. She no longer needed to.